Good morning, everyone. Everybody in their seats. Mayor Mitchell, in your seat, please. I want to welcome everyone to a beautiful Thursday morning at the Phoenician and reading the tea leaves panel. So if you were meaning to be in the building effective mayor and council relationships, you need to leave now. We're going to spend the next 90 minutes talking about the upcoming two elections, our primary, which is just next week, general, which is in about 10 weeks, and all the implications of this really important vote. So we're pretty happy to have three esteemed lobbyists down at the legislature to talk to you about all this, and I'll introduce Gibson McKay. Gibbs started out when he had real hair working for John McCain in his office, and has been a lobbyist for the last couple decades and has his own lobbying firm, Sherpa. So thanks a lot for coming, Gib. To his right is Scott Smith, who is a contract lobbyist for the League of Cities and Towns, but has also been a chief of staff to Governor Brewer. He was also the corrections lobbyist back in the day, so he's been to every prison and can tell you what prison is really like. Thanks for coming here, Scott. And then to his right is Marilyn Rodriguez. If you have a progressive issue, Marilyn is your person to go to at the legislature. She owns her own firm, Creosote Partners, and again, she kind of lobbies on every progressive issue down at the legislature. So
super easy, yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Just so you know, it's about $2,000 an hour combined with these guys right here. So it's great we get them for 90 minutes. I'm going to start with the most, look, we got a lot of races here coming up both next weekend in November. I'm going to start with probably the most important one, and that's mine inspector, right? Joe Hart actually has some competition this year with the Democrat, first time in like 8 years. We'll start with the race that is going to be probably the most fascinating to watch, and that is the race for U.S. Senate to replace Jeff Flake. Scott will tell you, a couple years ago he was on this panel, and he predicted then that Flake would not win his race. He was a little off. He didn't predict he would back out, but so I'll lead with you, Scotty. This race first we have a primary. Martha McSally, Kelly Ward, Joe Arpaio. It has been under the radar maybe since, except for the last couple weeks, but how do you view that race?
I think that is McSally's race to win. I think she is the odds-on favorite to take on Sinema. I think Kelly's gone too far to the right and has made some statements that I think are not helping her. I think Arpaio's going to get his share of votes, but it's going to be McSally at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do want to state at the beginning, I forgot to say, I do a lot of campaign work, and I'm on McSally campaign, and I'm on a couple of congressional races like Debbie Lesko, so just assume every race we talk about, I have a conflict, but I'll try to keep it neutral. So I am on the McSally race, so Gib will ask you, why is McSally so amazing and awesome?
She's a fabulous candidate. I mean, she's a former fighter pilot. Who doesn't love fighter pilots? So I think she's going to come out of that race, and I'm super excited to see the general election campaign unfold. I think that is going to be a super interesting race to watch. I think McSally's going to have her hands full. I know Kirsten Sinema. I've worked with her when I was in Governor Brewer's office, and she was in leadership in the House. She is a very engaging person. You can see how effective her campaign ads have been up to date. And so that's going to be a dogfight, and I think it's too close to call, but if I had to bet my mortgage on it, I'd have to bet Sinema actually wins that race.
I've seen Scott's house. It's a nice mortgage. Gib, you do a lot of work in campaigns.
I do.
You know, have you seen the polling in this McSally ward race? First, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I've seen it, and you know, it's obviously trending. McSally wasn't, you know, doing much. As you said, it's kind of been under the radar. As she's, you know, as a lot of these IEs, these dark money issue or folks have engaged, as has she. You can see her numbers rising. I think I echo Scott's comments that Ward hasn't helped herself very much, and I think Arpaio just was, you know, he's been, you know, he's just not there.
Boy, you were talking like an 86-year-old man.
Yeah.
Talking like
The $2,000 an hour, it's $1,900 there and $100 here.
Well,
so.
and you know, to the Republicans, one of you two, has McSally had to go too far to the right to then pivot to the general election that starts next week?
I think she has. You know, there's no secret that immigration is at the forefront of every campaign ad I've seen. And does that mean it's too far right? It probably communicates her message. They're both fighting for kind of that Trump. All of them are fighting for, all three of them, but that Trump, 25% or 30% that are there anyway. You know, is it impossible to come back to the middle? I'm not always convinced on the immigration issue that it's, you know, people make it a right-left issue. There's a lot of, I've done a lot of polling around the United States. I've done a lot of polling here in Arizona. It's not as, you know, there are a lot of Democrats that fall to the left. You got to remember, you're dealing with unions. Union guys don't like their jobs being taken from cheap labor. So it's not always that constant of a thing.
Marilyn, we'll move on to the Democratic side. There is a primary, but I mean, we all expect Kyrsten Sinema to win. She has raised $6 million, I think it is actually. And she spent a pretty good chunk of change. Has she defined herself before Republicans can turn their fire on her?
I think it's all going to come out, right, that she was a Green Party candidate way back when. I think the fact that she identifies as a openly bisexual candidate is going to come out. They're going to throw a lot of mud, and at the end of the day, will it stick? We'll see. Midterms historically are tough for the incumbent office. I know we're in some unprecedented times with the Trump Republican Party, but at the end of the day, the Overton window, for those of you who I've been back enough that I talk about Overton windows every year, it has shifted such that it's normalized, and I don't think it's going to be impossible for McSally to come back to the center. And what we've noticed, and this is, I think, the thing that is most interesting about the Sinema race, is that she has been keeping her powder dry. Right, she refuses to weigh in on major issues that people on my side of the fence are lighting their hair on fire about. And it is causing a lot of concern, and it's also causing some frustration on the ground and some unwillingness. It's resulting in some unwillingness to show up for her. And so I think there's going to be an over-reliance on national money. I think that national money will come in because Sinema is running for one of maybe two pick-upable, that's not a word, seats in the nation. And we all know that, you know, her race, whether or not she's willing to weigh in on the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, doesn't ultimately matter to national Democrats. What matters is having the majority in the Senate so that we have the control going forward.
Pick-upable, I don't think is a word, but what I think was going to be one word that Marilyn mentioned is Trump Republican Party. I think that's going to be one word over the next couple months in this race. But you had something?
I tend to agree agree with both of them, and Scott indicating that it's going to be a dogfight. I mean, it's going to be. Kristen Sinema is one of the best campaign people I've seen. I love Martha McSally, as I said, but she is one of the best campaigners. I mean, she calls me. I'm a lobbyist, so I give money to everybody, but she calls me, she asks me how my son's doing, is he still playing for the Longhorns, it's remarkable. Politicians these days don't do that, and she does it. She has a personal conversation with me. She is a unbelievable campaigner, and I say don't count her out. She's going to be tough to beat, and the national money that you talk about, it's a $100 million race, man.
Easily. And as we're, so I knock doors to talk to voters, and I talk to voters from every background. And I'm noticing that even the Democrats that are less plugged in than maybe the folks that I usually talk to are really impressed with her. And that goes for Republicans and independents as well. So I wouldn't hedge any bets in that race.
Mm-hmm. That is one, you touch on one thing, Marilyn. Every election, I think we all, probably most people in this room, we all live in a bubble because we live this. How hard is it going to be to connect with people in this race and then down ballot? Are we just living too much in the bubble with Trump? I mean, we all look at his tweets every day and cringe every day. Is that really what the general populace is doing, though?
There's a course at ASU. So I teach a course on lobbying, and one of my co-chairs teaches a course on fake news. And we talked a lot about how the demographics who plug into each independent individual news source get a very different message. So I'm not sure that it's as easy as it used to be to get out of that bubble. I don't think we're going to see for instance, I don't get ads about Trump or really any of Trump's Republican Party candidates, right? I don't get those. I actually have to seek them out, and I still am not getting them. So it's gotten to a point, social media and targeting and digital ads have gotten to a point where they're so sophisticated that they know who they're looking for, and that's the message that that individual is getting. And I talk to some Trump voters who say, on my Facebook, everyone's really happy about Trump. And I think that is so bizarre, because on my Facebook it looks exactly opposite. So I think that underscores and validates that point, which is that the media we are consuming is very different than it's been in a long time. It's not uniform across the board. We're targeting individual populations and saying very specific things to them.
Gib, you talk about a 9-figure campaign. Certainly it'll be an 8-figure campaign, but how will that money be spent? I mean, wouldn't it be cheaper just to pay every voter $10 or something?
Probably would be cheaper. Yeah. Absolutely, or $100. But there is the digital media that will inevitably garner some of that. But I think it's 20% of it, 20 or 30% of it. You look at Sinema; she's running a very disciplined campaign, very disciplined, and they'll do the traditional mail, they'll do the traditional television and radio, and then the geo-targeting and those kinds of things that you do in that ad space now, that's just kind of required. But it's so much more cheap to advertise digitally than everything else. So a majority of the money is going to still be spent on TV and radio and mail, and Well,
I'll say this: the Martha McSally campaign just released an ad this morning showing Sinema in a pink tutu at an anti-war protest, while transposing against a picture of McSally in her uniform and what she was doing at the time of the Iraq War and Afghanistan War. So I think that's going to play pretty heavily into that war service for McSally.
Absolutely.
On TV.
Absolutely.
So before we leave, I've already got Scott's prediction. Gib, hold on. What's your prediction for the winner?
Oh, God. I think Sinema is going to be tough to beat. I've been reading some national polls, and we're looking. It's a turnout campaign, and Republicans, what what I'm finding, are not as excited. You lose seats in these midterms, and otherwise. And so I'm seeing a +4 Democrat turnout. It's going to be a turnout election. They're just more excited. They're more pissed off, and they're going to turn people out. So.
I want to stay on federal elections. I'm sorry. Well, Marilyn, I think we know who you think is going to win. All right, so 2.5.
Cinema.
2.5 for cinema. All right. I want to move to congressional elections, and go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Scott just asked me, do I think McSally is going to emerge victoriously from the primary, and I'm not sure.
I think you were a cinema.
I think she's the strongest candidate, for sure, at least as it relates to fighting a cinema ticket. But at the end of the day, what we know from data is that the primary voter electorate in Arizona is very durable. It's very durable, which means it's far more conservative or liberal. We don't see higher turnout in primaries, and you're even seeing that confirmed now via the Secretary of State's office. If you don't follow Garrett Archer on Twitter, I would, because we're seeing that play out again, and that means that probably those same voters that are further to the right are going to be deciding that election, and I'm not sure that McSally's winning those votes. So I'm not sure she does. I think that's the hope, and that is certainly where a lot of the money is going. Anybody's guess.
I want to turn to congressional elections and a district that I really didn't think we would have to talk about, but will David Schweikert win his election?
Yes, I believe he will.
Really? I mean, look, we are in the Schweikert district as we speak, but Democrats are excited, I hear, about that race.
I think the registration advantage is too great for them to overcome to take that seat, even if there's a blue wave in that district.
Marilyn, agree or disagree?
Sort of disagree, sort of. Only insofar that that district in 2016, while it is the highest efficacy voting bloc of Republicans in the state, swung furthest to the left in Trump v. Clinton. So I think it really depends on whether those messages about tying Schweikert to Trump are resonating. I think Schweikert may benefit from the fact that there's just going to be so much noise. But I don't live in the district, and I don't work on any of the campaigns within the district, so I'm not sure what is being messaged to them.
Well, and there are 3 Democrats running to take on Schweikert.
Right. And they're all out knocking doors talking about this. So I think our odds are higher than usual. I think you're right that the voter registration is really going to come down. It's going to come down to that and whether Republicans, turn out. But I wouldn't count it out of one of those. Say we have a really big year that I'm always wishing for. I wouldn't count it out of that wave.
Mm-hmm. Gib, is this the one place in Arizona that Democrats could pick up, or are we seeing other seats that Democrats may have a chance?
Well, I tend to agree with Scott. I think Schweikert comes out of this, but I think it's interesting as McSally has vacated her congressional seat down in Tucson. I think you're going to see this used to be generally speaking Gabby Gifford's district, and it will. I have very little doubt that it'll flip and go into the Democrat. Right now it looks like Kirkpatrick's taking the lead, but there's a lot of Democrats vying for that seat, but I think at the end of the day it's probably Kirkpatrick.
Marilyn, what is up with Matt Hines?
He's closing in, and it's...
As he closes, I mean, he came out the other day and said Kirkpatrick is on meth or something to that effect.
It's election season.
There's a little bit of Trump in everyone, I guess. Really, I'm
I think we should all prepare ourselves for these petty attacks. I think the thing, though, that is helping him, and we're hearing it in our canvasses in Tucson, is that people are very frustrated that Kirkpatrick has a home in Phoenix and doesn't live in the district full-time. And so that is really becoming a problem for her in this race. And I think that they're working a little bit harder now as a result. I ultimately think that she will win, but Hines is getting closer as a result. I think the meth comment, while incredibly inappropriate, is a signal that, he's throwing everything at the wall to see what will stick to make up those last 4 points.
In CD1, well, first, let's stick down with CD2 again. Leah Marquez Peterson, who headed the Tucson Hispanic Chamber, was probably the leading Republican. I haven't seen polls, but she's certainly the one raising the most amount of money. Kirkpatrick or Hines versus Peterson, how is that race going to play out? Peterson is a well-known name down there.
Absolutely, Bert, but I think given this election cycle and the level of interest at a national level to take back as many seats as possible, I think it's going to be difficult to hold on to that seat for Republicans. And I think the engagement level down in Tucson is probably at a higher clip than maybe even up here in Maricopa County for the Democrats. So I think that's going to be a tough seat to hold on to.
Mm-hmm. What about in CD?
I've actually heard that Republican national parties have already pulled out of that race.
How about in CD1? Tom O'Halloran won that race 2 years ago, and we've got 3 Republicans vying, including Wendy Rogers, who five-time candidate and sort of leading the polls now, it looks like. But how is that race going to play out?
O'Halloran's coming back. We're in midterms, right? So, like you've been hearing, the enthusiasm from the Republican side is really flat. That is very normal historically, but in this particular time of election spending, you're seeing more money than ever. And in Arizona in particular, because of that top of the ticket race, where we have the chance as Democrats to take the Senate, you're going to see some coattail riding all the way down.
But McCain won that district. Trump won the district even by a slim margin. Why can a Republican not win in CD1? Scott?
I mean, it's Tucson. I think it's really hard for the Republicans to win that seat given the demographics in Tucson. It's not a district that is structured for a Republican to win. I mean, it does not favor the Republicans in that district, given the makeup, and like we've talked about, the interest level among Democrats this year. I see that is going to be a hard one to hold on to.
What about the race to succeed Kyrsten Sinema, CD9? You have Greg Stanton on the Democratic side, and in all likelihood, Steve Ferrara on the Republican side. Is Name ID going to win that race alone?
I believe so, absolutely.
100%. Yeah, the mayor of one of the largest cities in the country is running for a pretty safely blue Democratic district. Yes, he's going to win.
I agree. Although, I'll tell you what, Steve Ferrara is like really fascinating guy, fascinating story. He was the chief medical officer of the Navy. He has some really interesting background, but I think to overcome, as they say, the name ID and those kinds of things is going to be very difficult to do.
I slipped Gib 20 to say that stuff about Steve, so anyway. Does then the congressional the congressional delegation here flip back to Democratic controlled 5-4?
Maybe. I I mean, it's really hard to guess that in August. I think Tuesday will be a helpful indicator of what we can expect in November, but not completely helpful as far as predicting what will happen. Again, you see it's very much less than 20% turnout among the voter base in the primary election. Like I said, it's very, very durable. It's usually the same folks. You won't see engagement in the actual turnout until November 6th. And part of that is due to the 30-day registration deadline, right? So there are people who want to vote in the primary who can't because they've passed the deadline and are now, all of the canvases have shifted their focus because of this to the general election. So I think if you're going to see us flip to blue, it won't be apparent until about 2 to 3 weeks before the general election date.
Gib, you do a lot of work nationally. How much will the national mood on, say, Trump, and as you know, last couple days, the news networks have all been about impeachment, talk of impeachment and things. How much will that play into these local races?
Well, I think it does trickle down, and you know, coattails aren't as long as they used to be, obviously, but you know, you're seeing there's just more energy on the left side of the aisle right now, and I think it does translate a little bit, and from all the polls we're doing, and I'm seeing a +4. It's not, you know, it's not as dramatic as some in the media or others would have you believe. There is still a turnout model, but you know, I'm thinking, you know, some people are like it's +19, and just in generic tests as it relates to national, you know, candidates as it relates to Congress, you know, I'm looking at a +4 tip. That it depends on the district, it depends on the state, that kind of thing. But nationally, you're gonna, and you always lose seats in midterms. I mean, people forget this. That there were 1,300 seats that were lost to Republicans nationwide, that city councils, legislatures, while Obama was in office, and that is an unbelievable number. So there's a lot of making up to do, but that's a number you should not underestimate, and it will come back, but it's not as, you know, the sky's not falling at this point.
Scott, will Republicans look back and say, Obama, the good old days after this election?
Never.
Okay, all right. Marilyn, I do want to touch on, you know, kind of ask you some of the same question is, should Democrats sort of cling to and promote the idea of impeachment, or certainly at least being a thorn in the side of President Trump?
No. I mean, we definitely would love for the leader of our nation to not be what he is. I have choice words for anyone who wants to talk to me after.
You mean the most successful president ever?
But I think what we're focused on, right, is that we are, as women, facing the potential of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, right? In Arizona, it is technically a criminal act to seek out an abortion. These are things that we're talking about, right? We're really focusing in on winning the Supreme Court. We're focusing in on finding ways to build power back. I think the presidential election isn't for a few years. If you impeach Trump, you have Pence. I think few things change as a result. I hope that Congress does the right thing at the end of the day. But on the ground, in state to state, we're not talking about impeachment. We're talking about ways to make sure that we're setting up an infrastructure to make sure that whoever comes in to that office in the future can't throw lives into the balance like this president has so easily.
But Scott, won't hardcore voters on the left, won't they want to hear talk of the resistance and talk of drastic actions against Trump?
Absolutely, and I think that has been part of the Democrats' problem nationally in recent election years, because I don't think they are focused on the issues that Americans care about, and instead of talking about jobs and the economy, they're advancing their, no offense, Marilyn, but the leftist progressive agenda that does not sell well with middle America and voters that are more moderate, whether they're Republican or Democrat, and that has really damaged their brand. But you've got a core militant element that wants to hear those messages, and that is what's driving the Democratic Party. Much like on the right, you've got more of the libertarian, hardcore conservative driving the message on the left, and I think you got a whole boatload of average voters out there that can't identify with either of those sides.
Gib, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think what's really, people forget, how Trump, won the election is he appealed to, what we used to call lunch bucket Democrats. These were the union guys. He went into Ohio, he went into Michigan, he went into Wisconsin, he went into Pennsylvania and West Virginia. These are all blue collar guys. He won the presidency because he won those states. This is presidential politics at its core. And so I think, when Hillary Clinton was not the most appealing candidate, and I think we all saw, or a lot of people, at least 50% of the people saw it, but she was out hanging out with Jay-Z and Beyonce while he was in Ohio saying, these assholes sent your jobs overseas, and it translated.
Yeah. I partied once with Jay-Z and Beyonce. It was worth it, trust me.
Barrett, real quick, Barrett. I think we forget that the presidential election is decided by an electoral college, right? Hillary Clinton won the popular vote more than any other candidate in history. I think you're right that it doesn't matter for the presidential race, but you're right. The Republican Party has been chipping away at the Voting Rights Act for generations, and I know.
Jim, you got to be on mic.
I don't want to go into the talking head thing.
We really get along very well. I love Marilyn.
Same. But at the end of the day, electoral college politics do not decide our legislative, congressional, Senate races. I think the popular vote does matter, and those shifts in Legislative District 23 are warnings that the Republican Party should heed. Arizona is a red state, and I agree with Scott that it is not as far left as some would like it to be, myself included. But it's also not as conservative as I think folks are assuming it is. And you're absolutely right that we need to be talking about jobs, but we also need to be talking about, and what we're hearing is lack of funding in infrastructure, lack of funding in education, the fact that there are a ton of problems that have gone unsolved, and that voters, regardless of the party, feel like the incumbents, who are majority conservative, are to blame. And that's what I'm hearing at the doors. I mean, past the news, past the social media digital ads, what I'm hearing real voters saying is they're sick of the status quo, and they understand the status quo to be the conservative majority.
My interactions with people are they're pretty content with the structure today, and I think everybody's glad that the economy is humming and unemployment's at an all-time low, and everybody's 401k is doing pretty good. So I don't know, I'm not sure what the unhappiness is with, because it's certainly a whole lot better the last couple of years than the previous 8.
Well, let's move on to politics closer to home. Let's talk about the race for governor. We have 2 primaries that will be decided Tuesday. I'm going to go out on a limb and say Doug Ducey is definitely going to win nomination to the, especially since Ken Bennett hasn't even qualified for the $1 million in clean elections money. So we can probably skip that, except for to ask, what was Ken Bennett thinking?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know when Governor Brewer ran for re-election and she ran clean, our infrastructure, we had those signatures collected and those $5 within 7 weeks, I want to say. So I don't know. I don't think he had the right ground game in place place to orchestrate that, obviously. He was here the other night trying to collect his $5.
Right, yeah. On the last day, to turn in $5, I got accosted by one of his people.
I want to be his consultant. The bill, I'll invoice him for $1 million on the last day.
Yeah, well, he was not going to get that money. Anyways, but Marilyn, the real fight has been among David Garcia and Steve Farley. Neither of them had enough money to really run a good campaign, but it seems that David Garcia never had any money. Is that going to be a problem if he moves to the general?
That's always a problem, right? Especially in these contested primaries. It's if you have to spend a lot of your money fighting it out in the primary, you are inherently going to have less. Again, I think you're going to see some outside spending, you're going to see some top-of-the-ticket dividends, but David's going to have to work really, really hard on that turnout universe to emerge victoriously in November. And I think, to your point about money, or lack thereof, that is something that I think will be overcome, not to the extent that is going to come anywhere close to the support that the incumbent Governor Ducey has. He has very great relationships with the donor class nationally and locally, and I don't think either candidate, Farley or Garcia, ever thought to themselves, I'm going to have that much money at the end. It's always been a get-out-the-vote campaign.
If I can just weigh in on Garcia. So here you have a candidate who almost won the superintendent's race last go-around. Had he won Tucson, he would have won. I think his campaign is a perfect example of an individual that has been hijacked by the left and his messaging. He's the polar opposite candidate this cycle than he was last go-around, and I think that's gonna. I mean, if he gets out of the primary, he's not going to win the general election anyway, but I think he has done damage to himself because he was in great shape coming out after losing the superintendent's race, and I think he picked the wrong time to run.
I just heard a great explanation is he didn't hire campaign staff, he hired activists to work on his campaign. And
this is fascinating to hear, everyone. We consume very different news and have very different funds.
Well, Marilyn, let me ask. He's had he's gotten behind Abolish ICE. He had a staff member who had said derogatory things about both America and Arizona. He has certainly made significant missteps that a Republican, or if Steve Farley had money, could use. Is the Democratic base concerned about the things that he has said, or even the Democratic middle?
I find it very interesting that the Republican National Committee has spent $6 million to play in this primary. I think it shows that they're scared of David. I think they've seen polling that it's much closer than they want it to be and that they'd like it to be. And again, I encourage folks to get out into the districts and talk to voters. What they're upset about are, these holding facilities, these camps for children, separated families, right? We are a border state. Immigration is a big, big fight. It was always going to be a hyper-partisan race, but these attacks on David before the primary is even decided, I think the real story, the above the fray story, is that they have come to light because of the Republican National Committee and how terrified they are of him emerging victoriously on Tuesday.
So you don't think his Abolish ICE stance or some of those other things won't play in the general election?
But it'll be all up for grabs. It'll be all up for grabs. And again, the voter registration just period is a challenge he's going to have to overcome. Again, we have a lot of factors at play from the top of the ticket all the way down to the ballot initiative side, and what I see is there's way more enthusiasm on the left, and it may be enough, and I think it's possible to take that seat.
His comments are problematic, period. I mean, you can't, I do that polling around the U.S. and even in Arizona, and again, we go back to this, it's not a right or left issue. People don't believe you should get rid of customs enforcement, Democrats or Republicans, especially independents. It's just that it doesn't translate. I mean, it translates for, sanctuary cities in San Francisco, but it's not, that's just not where we're running.
Scott, Governor Brewer retained the ninth floor in 2010, mostly based on immigration platform. Has Arizona turned so much that we now will back someone who says we don't need any sort of border wall or any sort of border barrier between Arizona and Mexico?
Absolutely not. Immigration is still an issue on the forefront of Arizonans as well as citizens across the nation, and Gibby probably can attest to that from his polling. Immigration always polls. It's one of the top 2 or 3 issues, and it has for years and years. And the message of abolish ICE is a total loser in Arizona if you're running for statewide office.
And so I assume, Gibby, we'll see that comment, which was on videotape from David Garcia. We'll see that a lot. We'll become very familiar with that over the next several months.
If he comes out of the primary, which I think he will, I do think he'll get hit with it every opportunity that anybody sees. And one thing that we're not really talking a lot about yet, and I think it'll come up, is the independent expenditure campaigns they're going to put a tremendous amount of money under that message, including, all the immigration issues at hand, but those kinds of things especially.
I believe it's the Republican Governors Association has reserved $8 million in TV time. I mean, folks, if you ever want to learn about David Garcia or Doug Ducey, you're going to get a chance to.
And Barrett, we didn't even mention his speech in New Orleans, I believe it was in New Orleans, where he was basically calling for open borders. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is not a message that's going to sell well in a general election.
Doug Ducey has his faults, doesn't he, Marilyn? I just needed a bathroom break. I gotta go to the bathroom, so I figured just ask that question to Marilyn. I'll have 10 minutes.
I'm glad you relieved the tension in the room. I know that immigration is a really tough subject for both political parties to talk about, right? And I think it's especially telling that I follow Glenn Hammer from the Chamber of Commerce pretty closely in the Chamber Business News Network, and then also on Twitter, and see that Mexico is one of our greatest trading partners. The governor is constantly trying to reinforce that relationship and regird that relationship, and it's tremendously challenging when politics delve into or devolve into this discussion instead of the fact that we need to be working on bettering that relationship, right? And there are very symbolic and even regulatory things that we can do, steps we can take that we haven't, and I think during his term as governor, those didn't happen enough, and that's a problem. The fact that, and we're going to get into this, one of his ousted agency heads is now running for office, tried to, we'll get into Tim Jeffries in a second, can't seem to hold on to agency heads, right? And there's a lot of, I think, mismanagement that's going to come forward, but at the end of the day, he is very well supported by the national infrastructure. Like you said, the RGA is dropping $8 million. I think RNC is going to drop a few more million. And that noise is something that any candidate is going to have to, like David or Farley, Steve or David is going to have to overcome when they come out of the primary. And I think that's what you're going to see from our side.
Scott, as someone who has overseen agencies and whatnot, in fact, you were head of DOA, if I'm not mistaken, Scott has had almost every job in state government, every crappy job in state government, I should say.
I wasn't the DES director, though.
Yeah. Does it matter how many DES directors the governor has gone through and some of the inner machinations of the work of state government? Is that going to really ring with voters?
I think that is way inside baseball. I don't think that is going to impact his messaging in the campaign. I think it's going to be hard to attack him as a gubernatorial candidate because he's had some turnover within his agency directors. I think they're going to oversaturate the market with messaging from, funded by the RGA and others that's going to talk about the job that he's done in terms of education and jobs and tax cuts and university funding. And I mean, if you go and look at what he outlined, what he wanted to do in government and what he's done his last 4 years, it's pretty remarkable what he has accomplished. And I think it's going to be it's going to be hard for Garcia or Farley to get their message out, because the RGA is just going to drown the market in positive messaging about Governor Ducey and what he's accomplished with the Republican leadership in this state.
He has cut taxes every year, as we all know.
Yep.
The wild card is red for ed in Bastinet, and the general sense that there hasn't been enough done on education, right?
Well, let's, I do want to talk about that, because obviously if anyone was around 6 months ago, we saw the thousands of teachers who were marching at the state capitol, all wearing red, and I'm sure you were always behind a car that had red for ed on their back windshield. Scott, the governor responded. I mean, I heard a lot of people say Ducey flip-flopped. I think he responded to that, and then doled out 2 10% raises.
It's absolutely remarkable what Governor Ducey and the Republican legislative leaders were able to accomplish in terms of K-12 funding. Now, I think you have to be fair and criticize the governor a bit for not being more aggressive on the K-12 front at the onset. His initial teacher pay raise recommendations were woefully inadequate. I think that caused that was, if you ask me, that's what created Red for Ed. But then you have to give him credit for recognizing that he needed to do more. And I mean, that's what you want in a leader. You want somebody to stand up and do the right thing, and that's exactly what he did.
I guess, Gib, you could say he saw the parade and decided to, catch up and take the baton. Yeah. But the baton he did take.
No.
No, Marilyn, you disagree that a 20% pay raise?
The Bastinet polls at 80-20, right? And there's a reason why the governor hasn't weighed in on it, and I think that's because he's seen that polling and understands that voters are pissed about education funding.
If it's 80-20, wouldn't he, and you say he hasn't weighed in on it, but then wouldn't he maybe get ahead of that and join that rather instead? Or no? If he's the calculating politician.
Well, you have to think about what your donors want and what your voters want, and that's something else that people are going to attack him on. And we'll see what happens in November. I think it's his race to lose, but what I'm saying is that we have, as Democrats, a greater chance because of the Red for Ed movement, and because of the midterm elections, because of the Trump factor, because of the cinema factor, right? There's so much at play, and there's so much energy that it is possible, and he's not this untouchable politician.
Bert, I think this is a textbook case of when is enough ever enough. The Red for Ed movement, with each passing day that they were in their walkout, were losing support, and the legislature and the Governor Ducey come through with a 20% pay raise, and yet enough still is not enough. And I think that creates problems for the left and Democrats, because I think the more they push, and they're going to lose those middle-of-the-road voters that they need to win elections in Arizona.
Anecdote: Ken Bennett collected nearly enough signatures to qualify at the Red for Ed march. It's not just Democrats; it's everyone.
But not enough fives.
Yeah, but not enough fives. I'm waiting for that $1 million invoice. I think that it is an although an interesting anecdote, there is going to, I just cannot say how, so you have the governor's race, you have this U.S. Senate race, you have all these congressional races, you have hundreds of millions of dollars, pouring into this state, and getting above that clutter, getting above that fray for any candidate, much less issue, is going to be incredibly expensive. And so what starts happening at the national level is they start picking and choosing who's going to win, who's going to lose, and so because there comes a point where all that money starts spilling down, and it affects that's when you really do see coattails. So I don't know.
I want to move on to a race that usually doesn't garner much attention, but this year it is, and it well should. The race for Secretary of State. We have an incumbent who has been, I think, elected since 2000, I think was her first term in the legislature. And she was a great legislator, but running elections seems to not be her forte, huh, Gib?
I just tried to hand the mic off. I think I like Miss Reagan. I think she's in trouble. I think they've identified a weakness. Whether it was, a lot of times voters don't care. I mean, she's in charge of elections. The visual there is just so difficult to overcome. You have these 6-hour lines. People are standing in line. I mean, I drove home, that night at 8 o'clock at night, and there were, 8 o'clock at night, they still had lines. I mean, the polls had closed, apparently, but it was remarkable, and she's taken, and her opponent on the Republican side has taken straight aim at that, laid it at her feet, and she's going to possibly suffer the consequences.
Marilyn, this was a race I have heard the most enthusiasm from Democrats, assuming Michelle Reagan gets out of the primary. But that assumption isn't so good right now, is it?
Yeah, it's closer than anybody expected, and I think...
Actually, I don't think it's closer. I think it's farther apart for Steve Gaynor. Yes, I agree. It is further apart in that sense than anybody could have expected, especially going into the beginning of this year. And I absolutely agree that it is because of those optics that are so hard to overcome. That's a toss-up in my mind. And then as far as the Democrats being able to take the Secretary of State's race, I really think voters don't, especially if Gaynor wins, voters don't know what the Secretary of State is for the most part, or why they should care. I think it's going to come down to turnout. That's one of those races where it just depends on how many people show up to vote that day. Helen Purcell obviously lost her race 2 years ago because people remembered those long lines. I think people are going to remember Michelle Reagan and the problems with her office, both in August and, if she were to survive August, definitely November.
And Bert, as a former chief of staff to a governor and somebody that's managed a large organization like state government, this is a perfect case study for elected officials that come into office, and you always have to remember you don't get rid of the people that make the trains run on time, because you suffer consequences if you do. And I think to a large extent that's what happened here. You had tremendous turnover and a lot of institutional knowledge around the door, and her career has suffered as a result of that.
This office can't even find the switch to turn the train on. Katie Hobbs, I think, is running unopposed, right, for Secretary of State?
Correct.
So in a Katie Hobbs, Steve Gaynor race, where Gaynor puts in maybe $1 million or $1.5 million of his own personal money, is Katie Hobson going to have a shot, other than if Democrats turn out more than Republicans, which has hasn't happened in recent memory?
Yeah. It's going to come down to turnout. Gaynor has tacked very far to the right. His messages are very very nearly alt-right in a sense, very, very nearly. He toes the line, and I think there are a lot of individuals, Republican, Democrat, Independent, where that rhetoric makes them uncomfortable, and if he comes out, I think that is a liability. That said, like I said, the majority of people don't know what the Secretary of State's race is, why it matters, and especially if you don't have that optics problem with Reagan, I think it will come down to turnout, and whether or not the Democrats turn out more than Republicans remains to be seen.
I think Steve Gaynor's playbook looks a lot like the Doug Ducey for State Treasurer playbook. I think his messages are going to resonate well with average voters in Arizona.
I know, Marilyn mentioned, people don't understand Secretary of State, but it has been since 1974, and Jack Williams, for any of you history buffs and trivia buffs, 1974, since a governor was elected to office and left on his own accord after that term ended. Every other governor, or her accord, every other governor since then has been impeached, indicted, cabinet positions, the Bahamas, wherever. So it has been 2 generations since we have had a Secretary of State who wasn't elevated to governor. So I want to move to another good race in the general. There was no primary, but for Attorney General. Is there a more savvy, fun-loving, handsome Attorney General candidate than Mark Brnovich? I mean, handsome aside, but he is engaging, and he has done all the right things as Attorney General. And he is, if you ever get the chance to kind of one-on-one with him, he is an engaging person to interact with. Yeah, and a big deadhead.
Yeah, he listens to the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, and he listens to the Grateful Dead.
In spite of that. Yeah, he's very affable. He's a very, and he's made some wise decisions, and he's kept his head down when he's needed to keep his head down, and has been a pretty tough prosecutor. So from that standpoint, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's his to lose.
Mm-hmm. January Contreras, Marilyn, is she going to be a formidable foe?
She's brilliant, and I think a great candidate for that office. I think she does pose a formidable foe, especially in an midterm year. Gibb is right. Brnovich has kept his head down at all the right points. So I am very interested to see what tack she takes. Frankly, personally, I would like to see an Attorney General governor relationship consistently, where one is the opposite party of the other, so we have a constant check. That would be an ideal universe. But at the end of the day, I haven't seen anything that would pose as a massive liability for Brnovich to feel confident as I do closer to the top of the ticket. January, I wouldn't underestimate her, but she has her work cut out for her, as do all the Democrats all the way down the ballot.
So one of the races that, go ahead.
Just to piggyback, it shouldn't be understated that I think the Attorney General, whoever, I think it's going to be Brnovich, will be very busy, and I see several legislators over the next couple years, in the sense that there are going to be a lot of legal issues, and whether it's the solicitor or the Attorney General, there's the sports betting issue, there's the water issue that's going to come up. I don't know if any of the Indian gaming compacts are here, all of which the state needs a lot of legal representation. And the marijuana initiative is probably going to be back in for 2020. The opioid decisions that are coming out, they're going to have a busy Attorney General, and he's going to make 50% of the people happy, and probably piss off 50% of the people. So anyway,
I want to move to a low-rent race, the Superintendent of Public Instruction. I don't even know why it's an elected position, but it is. Diane Douglas has been quiet the last couple of years. Her first couple of years were marked by a lot of what my people call mishigas, a craziness that was out of control. So you have 2 people running on the Democratic side and 5 people on the Republican side, including the incumbent Diane Douglas. Can Diane Douglas pull this out? I mean, she won a contested primary last time.
It's interesting. Diane Douglas in the last election was the only candidate, I think in the history, there may have been, that lost Maricopa County and still won the entire, won and became the superintendent of public construction. And she appealed to rural voters. She appealed to a lot of folks. And so, I use that as a segue into, she also is in trouble in a 5-way race, or is it 4-way or 5?
Oh, I think it's 5.
Yeah, I think she's, there's Tracy Livingston. She's done a lot of work. There are a number of others. It's a 5-way race, and I always love 5-way races because they're all going to get about 19%, and one of them will get 20% or 22% or whatever. I'm not, math wasn't my strong point.
Yeah. Scott?
Yeah, crowded field, I think that actually benefits Douglas, being as she's the incumbent. I think there's not a lot of money to be spent.
None.
Can't get any messages out. So I think that gives her a built-in advantage. It wouldn't surprise me if she wins that race.
And Marilyn, the winner of the Democratic primary, I guess Shapira is leading that. What can he do, no matter who the Republican is, what can he do to break through? I mean, again, $8 million from the RGA, $25 million in the Senate race. How is someone
that's
on a down ballot race
crazy. I don't think voters are going to see a lot of the messaging from SPI. But what they are going to see is superintendent of public instruction right on top of a ballot that they turned out to vote for Invest in Ed or against Invest in Ed. This is the closest office to the Red for Ed movement. And due to that, I think this is going to be a very interesting race to watch. And to the Douglas point, I just wanted to get a sense of who the candidates were, and I watched the debate, as I'm sure 10 other people did. And to the extent voters are paying attention, because I've been told for 2 years now or 4 years now that Diane Douglas is this terrible candidate. She's totally off the rails. She was the most composed and controlled candidate on those debates. It was remarkable. And I think that, to the extent voters are paying attention, again, all 10 of them who watched it, plus the incumbency, the power of the incumbency, and the packed primary, it's looking good for her. At the end of the day, though, she and all 5 of them have declined to endorse the Red for Ed movement. Some have called it a communist plot, a socialist plot. I don't know if the polling is showing that is something that is going to help you in the general, but I highly doubt it. 75,000 people showed up. There are thousands of teachers in our state, and none of them feel like this is some kind of plot.
We'll just touch very briefly on one last statewide race before we get to some of the initiatives and, legislative candidates. But Corporation Commission, usually this is, again, a quiet race, just a partisan race, and here you have 4 people running for 2 slots in the Republican primary and 3 people running for 2 slots in the Democratic primary. And APS, the entity that usually or has recently gotten involved is staying out of this race. How do you view that race, Gib? You have 2 incumbents running, but does incumbency really matter in this kind of race?
I think it does in this. People don't pay attention. People don't generally know what the Corporation Commission does. I think these guys have had, Tom Farese and Justin Olson have been at the discussion point of this, and I think it does matter, especially if there's not millions and millions of dollars being spent directly on the race. APS and some of the entities that sometimes play in these races are being very careful about how they interact. I think there's been a lot of indictments and things like that keep people at bay.
Marilyn, is this the best shot in a decade for Democrats to pick up seats at the Corpcom?
Potentially, yeah. This, again, midterm, down ballot. You're seeing millions of dollars on the Clean Energy Initiative and the vilification of APS and regulated utilities across the board. I received a mailer from the Clean Energy Initiative the other day talking about why the Corporation Commission is important. And I've heard, though cannot verify, that there are going to be millions of dollars from the left spent on the Corporation Commission. So it is possible that voters will hear more so than they ever have before about this office.
I did hear Tom Steyer was willing to pony up $4 million for the Democrats.
I get Glassman signed up for the wrong primary this year.
All right, we're done now. I want to touch on a couple of legislative races. There are five men sort of running for redemption, return. You have David Gowan in southern Arizona, Tim Jeffries, we have mentioned in the Scottsdale area, Paul Mosley, who couldn't be here today. He decided to only drive 65. And David Stringer, who batshit crazy is, doesn't even begin to describe. So, you have these men, and I should also mention Don Shooter looking to come back in Yuma, West Valley District. Scott, these are five deeply flawed men who may not realize how flawed they are, but, have had issues in the last several months. Is it possible we could have a Senate that includes both J.D. Mesnard, Michelle Ugenti, Rita, and Don Shooter?
It's certainly conceivable. This is Arizona politics. So I think Mosley's got a race on his hands. I think he's vulnerable. I think Stringer has got a challenge. Jody Rooney is, I think, well-known and well-liked up there in Yavapai County. Shooter, it would not surprise me if Shooter came back to the Senate. I know from earlier in the election cycle he was up significantly in that race. They've spent, 6 figures bashing him, so I think he's probably trailing now. I think you might see an element of the Trump effect, though, with Shooter, where people aren't going to tell anybody they're voting for him, but they vote for him. It's going to be interesting to watch next Tuesday. That's all I've got to say.
Gib, Stringer does have a primary, and he had made some incendiary comments at a Republican meeting. And then Mosley had his legal problems with the inability to drive the posted speed limit. Will voters care about those not insignificant issues?
Yeah. When given when given an alternative, I think both Mosley and Stringer have credible alternative candidates that it can turn an election. Absolutely, does incumbency overtake some of that? But at the end of the day, if there's enough, I guess, volume put underneath those messages, certainly it can turn an election, and there was incendiary comments made, and Mosley was his own worst enemy. I mean,
I think we're in LD 28 right now. Kate Brophy-McGee will have a significant challenge. This is a competitive district, and from Christine Marsh, a teacher, heavily tied to the Red for Ed, but again, running against Kate Brophy-McGee, and I know you've done work for her, Scott. Your firm has, the previous firm had. So how do you see that race coming? I mean, that literally could control whether the Senate remains a Republican Senate or flips to a 15-15.
I was just going to say, I think that Senate, I think Kate's going to come out of it. Name ID, Kate Brophy-McGee. I think there was, prior trouble when Maria Sims' husband registered as an independent and then qualified, or tried to qualify. And that would have been problematic. I think a lot of independents, she might have lost some votes. I think it's better for her now. Not that Christine Marsh is so I live in the district, and I'm actually a Republican precinct committeeman in the district, and so I think the interesting race to watch in that district is the Kelly Butler race with Kathy Petsis and Maria Sims, and I think Sims might have a race on her hand, and it's not inconceivable that race or that district has dual representation. I mean, you had the prior minority leader, Eric Meyer, Dr. Meyer represented it at the same time a Republican, the Democrat and the Republican. That district is one of those real moderate districts, so and very well watched.
Well, so we only have about 15 minutes left to go, and I really want to get to some of the ballot initiatives that are up here. I mean, the biggest one, the one that will garner, let's see here, I got to count the digits. It's 8 figures if it makes the ballot, is the clean, healthy, renewable energy one. Marilyn, what kind of boost would that give to Democrats, and if that qualifies for the ballot and is on the ballot come November? And first of all, an APS, TEP, and the rural co-ops would have to get half of their energy from some sort of renewable source, hydroelectric power, solar power. So would require shuttering down a lot of coal-fired plants, natural gas plants.
Right. You're already seeing a lot of investment from the Clean Energy Campaign into that turnout campaign that you've been hearing about in lots of the districts. So I think, just generally speaking, it incentivizes more money put towards those efforts, because of course they want to win that race. I'm not sure if it will have a boost on Democratic turnout. I think it may have a boost on turnout across the board for any individual who cares about renewable energy. I think and I know you want to trickle through, I don't know what format you want to go through. I think Invest in Ed will definitely bring out more of the individuals to the left, but again, not just exclusively focused on them. And then the one that I hope that we spend some time talking about is the Realtors Initiative banning the tax on services. So I think that, especially as it relates to the League of Cities and Towns, has the potential to have the greatest, most disastrous impact to the state. And that's the one that I'm not sure any money is being spent on or any attention is being paid to. And for that reason, and also not knowing if the dark money initiative is going to be on or not going to be on.
You're getting ahead of me, Marilyn.
I'm sorry. But as it relates to clean energy, I don't know if it's going to be a driver of turnout beyond the investments that you see because it is on the ballot.
Gib, the APS-backed groups are talking about, and the energy companies talking about this renewable initiative being a killer for jobs, increasing our utility rates, and forcing the shuttering of Palo Verde. How is this campaign going to get that message out? Again, when we're sort of crowded with McSally and Ducey and everyone else?
Well, I think it's a good old-fashioned attack campaign. There's no secret that Tom Steyer is the individual, the multi-billionaire, blah, 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 whatever he is, out-of-state billionaire, and that's what they're going to attack mainly. This is a bad idea for Arizona. Let Arizonans dictate their own policy as it relates to energy and water and all those types of issues, and keep those damn outsiders out of here. That's what depending on. I haven't seen any polling on it yet, but that's how I'd go at it.
Scott, is there a problem with the idea of getting more renewable energy? I mean, isn't solar a good thing?
Yeah, renewable energy absolutely is a good thing, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of jobs and the economy. I think we need to have a more strategic and thoughtful approach to mandates with respect to renewables. This proposal is going to drive up electricity costs for consumers, for business. It's going to be a jobs killer, and it's going to set back the Arizona economy, unequivocally, without a doubt. It's bad news for Arizona.
It also doesn't include, and I don't know people's policy position, but there are things it does not include, nuclear power. Some people don't agree that should be. It's still fairly clean energy, unless you're built on a fault line. I mean, we have the biggest nuclear power plant in the world sitting 70 miles outside, or 50 miles, whatever, and to not include that as part of your energy plan is just, it's somewhat silly, but that's my opinion.
So, Bert, an interesting angle on this with these ballot measures, the clean energy one as well as the Invest in Ed, is the role of the business community. And they lost the minimum wage battle last go around. These are two massive ballot initiatives that will have huge implications in Arizona, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how aggressive the chamber and the business community are in their efforts to defeat them.
One place where they are very aggressive and so far are winning that race is the Outlaw Dirty Money, which is the dark money, anti-dark money campaign. After the county recorders went through and did their due diligence, the initiative came up short. I'm sure there will be a lawsuit to try and rehabilitate some signatures. They only fell 2,000 odd signatures short. Is that's a campaign the business community will oppose vigorously?
Absolutely. And I should have included that in my original list. All of those ballot measures, I think, are going to present huge challenges to the business community, and I know that they are going to engage aggressively because, I don't think the state can afford to lose the Invest in Ed or the clean energy one. The dark money one, I think it's a little inside baseball that's hard to translate to average voters at times. We'll see it if it's on the ballot.
Marilyn, I just want to get Marilyn in on this. As someone who knows a lot about dark money here, but do people understand what dark money is? It was good to rebrand it dirty money, but do they know what dark money is?
They know. Yes, they know.
They do know. They know it ain't good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I know we've been talking about this for about a decade, right? That the use of the phrase dark money wasn't working. Well, now we've seen the polling, and we saw an initiative from the voters that was majority volunteer get pushed because people are sick and tired of the spending in politics. And I think whether or not it qualifies, that is not going away. People feel very disenchanted by the amount of spending, again, not only to individual lawmakers, but then just in the independent expenditure universe. To the extent, we will see a dark money disclosure initiative on our statewide ballot, remains to be seen. But we saw it in at least one city, and it passed by 90%. So I think people are, especially the Arizona voters, are starting to show that regardless of what your political affiliation is, you're sick and tired of seeing so much money go towards our politics.
I hate, as a guy who made a lot of money off of independent expenditures, I obviously hate the idea of every time we've gotten involved in an election matter that's just, whether it be, clean candidates and all those kinds of things, it's fouled things up. It's never had the outcome that I think has been desired by anybody that's pushing this forward. Dark money is just another example. The basis by which dark money was ruled on and why the Supreme Court ruled the way it did is, I bet no one in this room, what they do is what a lot of companies and individuals do is they give money to a nonprofit, and that nonprofit will donate that money to political campaigns. That's what dark money is. I think people assume that has happened anyways. The reason the Supreme Court ruled the way it did, and this drives me crazy because dark money and dirty money is such a marketing term, but people forget that in the 1950s, the Attorney General was seeking the donor list and the membership list of the NAACP, and the Supreme Court said, you don't need to know that. There is sometimes anonymous political voices are okay. And so they reaffirmed that in Citizens United in 2010, and if this really didn't count, then they would have included, if it wasn't a ploy, then they would have included labor unions on this, which they left out of this thing. So be careful what you vote for.
Yeah,
That's it.
I think you're right that people forget, right? And then people also forget the Scalia dissent in talking about the fact that he agrees that disclosure is what is needed for transparency in a healthy democracy. And at the end of the day, people may not care about any of this, but what they do care about is that they feel like the system is rigged, the president keeps saying it's rigged, and they feel like what matters is not their vote, but the money that is spent, and that is inherently a problem that we have.
And we just spent the past hour, she just quoted Trump, just so you guys know.
You agree with the president on something?
I think she agreed. I'm putting that in an IE mail.
All right. We only have a few minutes left with our $1 Million Trio, so I wanted to open it up and maybe one or two questions. If anyone in the audience has anything, because they can talk up here for hours. They're lobbyists. They're paid to talk up. So, yes, sir.
Just a real quick one for all of you. If the Democrats take back the House, will Nancy Pelosi be Speaker?
Oh, gosh, I have no idea. I mean, probably.
Yes.
Yeah, probably, yes. I know that is something that they're putting out there. I'm not really sure why it matters, but yes, probably.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you talked a lot about how the right findings, person said about being bisexual or a Green Party member in the past, but you didn't talk about Trump's legal problems and how that would affect McSally, County Board, and our fire.
In the primary election, I think those Republican candidates are able to capitalize on the left and their attacks on the president. And then as those candidates segue into the general election, it's all going to come down to turnout. And I believe that the Trump Republicans are going to stick with those candidates, and it's just going to come down to turnout as to how those races shake out. If enough Democrats turn out and the Republicans don't, then we may see them we're going to lose a couple of those seats. I mean, that's how it shakes down.
I think also what you have is a situation where we don't know the extent to which his legal troubles are going to be or not. And I mean, you got a guy who just pleaded guilty and a guy that just got convicted of 5 counts, and who were close to him, but none of it related to the original points that were being investigated. That they'll continue to revolve that message, I think, is what I see happening. Does it translate into some other thing? I don't know. I don't think so. And even if it does, is it impeachable? I don't know. I don't think so.
We'll end this with a question from Senator John Cavanaugh. If I know John Cavanaugh like you guys do, it'll be a 4-minute statement ended with, don't you agree with me? So, Senator Cavanaugh.
LD23.
And LD23 is his current district, no.
I'm not saying, are me and Lawrence going to win?
And that, I think what he's asking about is the Senate campaign, which features Michelle Ugenti-Rita versus Tim Jeffries, who used to be the DES director until he got fired right before November, or Thanksgiving rather, of a couple of years ago, and Christine Kelly, who was a first-time candidate, and it has been a nasty, nasty fun race if you're into that kind of thing. So I'll start with Gib or Scott.
In LD23, Cavanaugh and Lawrence are going to return to the legislature. On the Senate side, that is another dogfight, and I think Jeffries is well positioned, and I think there is a possibility that he may upset Ugenti.
Well, I guarantee he's already upset Ugenti, but will he win? That's the question.
She's pretty upset.
I think there's a reasonable chance that Jeffries is going to knock her off.
And I think there's a chance that she could come in third behind Christine Kelly, but I've seen some polling that does say that Jeffries is ahead in that race.
So I've seen that same polling. You know, who knows for sure? I know that Ugenti-Rita has, with all due respect to has always been the top vote getter in that district. I think it's the hair.
Blasphemy.
But I'll say this: I think she's in trouble. She's had people making phone calls on her behalf, trying to raise more money. I think Jeffries has spent a tremendous amount of money defining some of her problems and problematic issues, and so it's, as he says, it's a barn burner. But I think she might have some trouble.
Mm-hmm. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. And the 3 best words in the English language is lunch is next. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you guys for coming out.